from the Bazemore community. One day I had a group of the widow ladies from the White's Chapel Church that I attend to come to my house for lunch. We usually would get together and go out to eat somewhere once a month together for as long as we were kindly able to drive and to do so. And during conversations, somebody asked where my mother and father-in-law went to school. And I said, well, my father-in-law went right over in Bazemore to Gravel Hill School. Only one of those ladies had ever heard of Gravel Hill School. And she was almost getting to be close to 100 years old herself, and her husband had attended Gravel Hill School during his first years of school. So I got to thinking about that, and I got to thinking about there was a lot of history on land that our family now owns. The Tucker branch runs through part of our land, and this early, one of the early first settlers had a water grist mill on that branch. Sharon has found nails that date back to 1800 that she has found in the area where that was located. And also, there have been at least 5 different log cabins on land where we live that we know of. And we wanted to know who lived in those log cabins. And back behind my house is Mill Branch. And in that branch, early settlers dug up big slabs of rock with no kind of tools like we have today, and used those for the foundation to build houses on. And there was an old shed when I first came to that area with my husband in 1960 that had a lot of those old hand-cut wooden shingles that they began to roof houses with. And several of those old shingles were still left there from the person that cut those shingles years and years ago. So I thought about all this information for days, and I finally decided, well, I'll try to research and find as much information as I could about the Bazemore community and type it up and record it. So Sharon agreed to go with me to interview people. And after we interviewed several people, she's kind of got more interested. And she decided she'd help me. And she became my main researcher. At the time we were doing this history, I was keeping my 3 great-grandchildren, and during the day while their mother worked. And so she got to the courthouses and the cemeteries and people's houses and researched a lot for me during the daytime. Then when the grandchildren went home, I'd try to put what she put together in written order and type it up on the computer. So over 7 years we did that. When first settlers came to Bazemore, not long after Alabama became a state in 1819, the part of the area known as Bazemore today was a part of Marion County at that time. And it was not until 1867, after the Civil War, that lines were redrawn and Bazemore became a part of Fayette County. We kept thinking we needed to go to Marion County Courthouse and see if we could find more information there, but we got more we could put in this notebook. So, and I got older, and a lot of times I'd be sickly, and just sort of had to draw it to a close at that particular time, but she kept on working. The first person that settled in Bazemore was George Brown, and he came from Georgia.
No, South Carolina.
So-
Chester.
sorry.
Chester.
You have to help me.
Chester.
He came from South Carolina. He came with an uncle and some more of his family relatives, his mother's brother. And he patented land from the United States government in 1825. He became one of the biggest farmers in the Bazemore area, and according to agricultural census, he sometimes grew the most Indian corn of anybody in that area. And he and his sons and his sons-in-law patented a lot of land, both in what was Farron County at that time and also in Walker County. They probably had or did have over 2,000 acres of land. We don't know exactly where George Brown is buried, and many of his sons moved to Texas, and a lot of the rest of them moved away somewhere. So there are really not any Browns left in Bazemore today. But she has, after we finally got through with this, she wanted to do more on George Brown and his family, so she researched and put together information on him and found out a lot of other things about him. The second person to patent land in Bazemore was another George. He was George Tucker. He was originally from Virginia, but he moved to Georgia, his family did, and he fought in the Revolutionary War with the Georgia militia. His father fought in it with him, as well as one of his brothers. When George Tucker moved to the Bazemore area, he was about 80 or 81 years old. He was pretty old to come all that way at that time. And he lived to be 106 years old. He had a water-powered mill on Tucker Branch where he ground cornmeal. And this was a blessing. A lot of you probably know about the old corn mill that was on down in the New River community, where they had a great big water wheel. At first it was wood, and then later they bought a wooden wheel to do the grinding of the corn, and they also ginned cotton there too for a time. But George Tucker had a large family also, and he brought most of his children, most of them already married at the time they came. He brought them with him to Bazemore, and they patented a lot of land in that area, and there's still a lot of Tuckers that live in the Bazemore area or the nearby areas. Once every third Saturday in March, the Tuckers hold a reunion at the Hopewell Cemetery where he is buried, and hold that reunion in honor of him. And they get together and talk about family descendants and who all's kin to who at that get together, and have a big lunch. So if any of you want to come this May and the third Saturday, they'll have a lunch. And
it's on the grounds at the cemetery.
Yeah.
Or on the grounds.
Yeah.
If it's not bad weather.
We don't know where George Brown is buried, but we do know that George Tucker's buried in the Hopewell Cemetery. George's son, George Tucker Jr., was the first person that was known to be buried in the Hopewell Cemetery. He died in 1840, and the George Tucker Sr. died in 1860. He's also buried there. There's still a few people buried in that cemetery. When the people first came to Bazemore, of course it didn't have a name, but it's been handed down that the first name of the area was Amore, and at that time Winfield was called Needmore. We thought perhaps the people might have called the area of Bazemore by the name where they got their mail. And there were 4 different places on old census records for the people that lived in Bazemore. The first post office was in Dublin. Any of you know where the White's Chapel Church is located? The Tidwell Chapel Church on County Road 24. There, ever since I've been living down in the Fayette County area, there was an old sign that led to the community of Dublin that said Old Stagecoach Road, and it's still there today. It was put up after the Byler Road was built through the area. The old Byler Road goes through the old country dirt road of where the Dublin community is located. Another place was the New River community on down past Bazemore and Whitechapel, where there was a post office in the home of Hugh McCaleb. And many of the residents of Bazemore had the address of New River Post Office. Then some, that was probably on the eastern part of Bazemore near the Sipsey River in Walker County, got their mail from Eldridge Post Office. It was one of the early post offices too. And then some from the Glen Allen Post Office, which was first held in the Ashton's store in Glen Allen. And it was a long time before the community got the name Bazemore. When the railroad came through Bazemore and Winfield in 1887, there was an engineer whose last name was Bazemore, and they had to stay in that area a good long while because they had to build a big long trestle to go over the Sipsey River. And people took a liking to this Mr. Bazemore, and so they finally named the area the Bazemore community. So there was another nickname that was given to the area that a lot of the older people in Bazemore today still remember people calling it. During the Depression days, a lot of the people in that area were losing their farms. They had to mortgage their farms to buy the land, and they didn't have enough money when the end of the crop came to pay the mortgage because prices dropped so low for cotton and other goods that was grown on the farms that people couldn't pay them. So guess what people began to do? They began to make moonshine whiskey in the wintertime in an effort to get enough of money to pay the mortgage off for their farms that they had. And so many people sold moonshine in fruit jars that Bazemore became known as Fruit Jar Johnson. Nobody knows that today, probably except just the very old people, and most of them have already passed and gone on, but a few of the grandchildren know it because it was passed down to them by their parents. The Byler Road was one of the first acts of the legislation after Alabama became a state. And that provided a good way for early settlers to come in to Bazemore. Another two early roads that was on down past Amory, Mississippi, going up the Florence way was the Cotton Gin Road and Gaines Trace Road. The Cotton Gin Road was built by the government for the Choctaw Indians that lived in that area in an effort to try to civilize them. He built it on the old Choctaw Indian trail, and they built the Cotton Gin at what later came known as Cotton Gin Port. The Indians worked that for a while, and they got suspicious of the government, thinking they were trying to do something suspicious, and they burnt the Cotton Gin down. But a little thriving community grew up there, and lots of people moved into that area, and they had hotels and all kinds of stores. And they had a boat landing there where they could have connection between North Alabama and South Alabama. On that boat connection, boats could go down the Tombigbee to Mobile, and they would carry cotton and coal to sell there, and they'd bring back oil and salt. And that, finding that helped to solve the mystery to me of where did the people in Bazemore get salt they had to have to preserve food. They had to preserve their meats and other foods to have food. So that was a blessing to me to be able to find that information, because I'd read about some of the men during the Civil War that were too old from Bazemore to go get salt for the people in that area. I didn't know where he went to, but I'd read that in some books, that the names of like Thomas Lyon, one of the residents, that was old, too old to fight, and he'd go get salt and help do things for the women that were left in that area. Between the 1930s and the 1830s and the 1850s, a lot of people began to move into the Bazemore area. Log cabins were built and other things that they needed. But then in the 1860s, here came the Civil War. And that was a horrible thing for the people in the Bazemore and the nearby communities. It wasn't a war in Bazemore and the surrounding communities of soldiers against soldiers. It was a war of community members against community members, against neighbor against neighbor. The majority of the people in the northeast Fayette County there wanted to stay out of the war. They didn't want any part of it. And a lot of the ones in Marion County and Winston County. But they ended up being forced to either fight in the war or the men to hide out in the woods and caves and mountainous areas where they wouldn't be forced to become a part of the Civil War Confederacy. But Home Guard was organized, and they hunted down the men that would not fight in the Confederacy. And they built the prison over in Bobo area, the Hartsook prison, and they rounded up men that would not fight and put them in that prison and threatened to shoot them and do all kinds of horrible things to them in an effort to get them to join the Confederacy. several of the men did join, and several of them later escaped from the Army of the Confederacy and went to places where they could join up with the Union. And a lot of the ones that didn't go to the Confederacy joined up with the Union. We have stories of some in our book that did that very thing. Excuse me just a minute, let me get a water, and I'm getting in the surrounding area where the men hid out became known as Freedom Hill because they just wanted their freedom. They didn't want to take part in the war. There were a lot of people from the Bazemore and the adjoining communities that were shot or mutilated by the Home Guard because they wouldn't take part in the war, or some had deserted that had joined the Confederacy and they were hunted down, and we have stories of that in here. One of the stories you may have heard about was Rachel and the Home Guard from the White's Chapel community that adjoins Bazemore. Was a family that had a young boy that he refused to join the Confederacy, and the Home Guard was after him, and they came to his father's house one day trying to find him, and they sort of strung up the father on a tree, and the boy that was wanting to join the Union Army was hid, but he saw that they were maybe going to really hang his dad, so he came out to try to protect his dad, and they shot him. Well, the Home Guard got the doctor to come to, see about him and try to get the bullet out, and they decided they needed to wait a little while and let it fester up before they got the bullet out. But while he was mending up a little bit, a group took him down to the Sipsey River that was close to where he lived and met some people that were going to take him to the Union Army, met a little boat there. And that story has been handed down by Myrtle Heron, who taught at Somerville School at one time before you were there. And she also wrote a lot of articles that were put in the Fayette newspapers about log rollings and building log cabins and making lye soap, and camp meetings that were held in the Bazemore area at the campground, which later became Campground Cemetery. So there was a lot of history that she helped to preserve from the things that were done in that area. And then in the 1877, the railroad was built through the Bazemore and Winfield area. And there was a crew working from Birmingham coming this way with the railroad, and there was a crew from Mississippi coming this way. And when they met together at a tool house between here and Ewing, they drove a gold spike in the cross tie there where the railroad workers met and completed that. And some of the old history that we found about the Bankhead Highway that came through this Winfield area and the edge of the Bazemore area, that when one of the Bankheads, William Bankhead, that was a representative to the United States government, died, they held a little funeral there in Washington, D.C. for him, and then they brought him to Jasper, where he was originally from, by train. And not only did he come, but President Franklin Roosevelt rode the train with his cabinet members, and there was about 53 senators and a whole bunch of representative members that rode the train and came there for his funeral. Rode the train on the railroad track that comes through Bazemore and Winfield. So there's a lot of history there. They didn't really have a depot in Bazemore, but they had a train passenger house where they could stop, let passengers get off, and where people could board the train. But they could also board the train other places along the railroad track. When her great-grandfather, Virgil Hollingsworth, Dodd died, he was sick with typhoid fever, and they called Dr. Gallagher from Bazemore to come to see about him. And when the train got to the railroad crossing at Tucker Branch, they always would blow the train whistle to let people that were walking or people that might have wagons or some of the first cars know that the train was coming and get off of the railroad track. And one of his daughters heard the train blowing, and she told her father that the doctor would be there soon. He said, "Just hold my hand, honey. I won't be alive when he gets here." And sure enough, he passed away before the doctor got into the house. His wife, her great-grandmother, fed a lot of hobos that got off the train there at Bazemore during the time that she lived there. You know, people were starving to death during the Depression days. Couldn't find jobs anywhere, and they'd get off the train at places, hobo ride, you know how they do that, hide in some of the cars, and they'd get off. And a lot of them would stop at her house, which was close to the railroad track there. And they would ask her for food. If she had anything cooked, she'd feed them. And if she didn't have anything cooked, she'd scramble them up some guinea eggs. They had a lot of guinea fowl. She'd scramble them up, some of them, or if she didn't have any eggs, she'd tell them to go to the wood pile and bring in some wood. And she'd fire up the stove and cook something that she had. And another thing that happened, the hobos said this is a good place for other hobos to stop. So they put a cross on the back of her barn that faced the railroad track to let other hobos know that would be a good place to stop. And, you know, life changed drastically after the railroad came through there. You know, people could now travel back and forth to different places. Some of the Bazemore people could go to Eldridge by the train to get some things from the Kelly store that they needed. And some even come to Winfield. And later some of the girls finished high school, had never been to a big city like Birmingham, and they begged their parents to let them ride the train to Birmingham to just see the city. And, you know, people could do a lot of things. There was one girl from the New River community on down past Bazemore and Whitechapel that came to the train passenger house in Bazemore, either riding a horse or riding a buggy pulled by a horse, and she'd get on the train and come to Winfield, and she finished high school in Winfield. And some of the other people did the same thing and rode the train to Eldridge. Eldridge had a good early school. And there were 3 different churches and schools in Bazemore. There was the Hopewell Church. It was a missionary Baptist church at first. And they held school in that church. It was built adjacent to the Hopewell Cemetery. You know, after several years, along about time of the World War II, the building was burned. They quit having church about beginning of the 1900s in that church building because churches of Christ began to be built in the area, and people began to go to those newer churches rather than the old church that was there. Some of you know Thomas Tyree that used to read meters in the Bazemore and the Winfield area. He said that his mother, who lived to be almost 100, told him that Babe McCollum taught school for the blacks in that area for some time, but it was mainly for the whites to start with. We have a list in the book of, we don't have a list of the teachers at the school, but we have a list of a lot of the preachers that preached at that Missionary Baptist Church, according to research information that Bill Tucker from Benton, Arkansas gathered up. He came to the area to find out about his great-great-grandfather, George Tucker Sr., that, you know, I told you about, that came to Bazemore. And he had some of that information recorded in the heritage of Marion County that you have in the library here, and the heritage of Fayette County. I don't know if you have a copy of that here, but I know they do at the Fayette County Library. And that's the only written and recorded information that I had ever seen about Bazemore. In the 1970s, the Fayette Broadcaster newspaper printed 3 different books on the history of Fayette County, and not a single word was written about Bazemore because nobody, they asked people to send information to be recorded, and nobody sent anything. I thought about that too, and I had some of those books, and there was a lot of good information in those books about Fayette County. But Jimmy and Jeanette Herron and some other people helped to put together that book about the heritage of Fayette County. What George Tucker had recorded and saved was put in that book. So I said that's the only thing I knew that was recorded. And if you've never looked at the Fayette County book, it has some really good information in it. I know you probably looked at the one for Marion County. But as I said, the railroad changed lives for people in that area. And the last 100 pages of this book is about families that lived in Bazemore in the late 1800s and the early part of the 1900s. And there's some interesting things that we found that grandchildren told us about some of the older people that had already died and moved on. Sharon dug up a lot of information from census records and from Ancestry.com and from Find a Grave, and also the Fayette County Courthouse had a lot of information from deeds and mortgages and wills and plat book maps and miscellaneous records and all kinds of things. She spent so much time down there in the winter part when she couldn't do things on the farm that a lot of people thought she worked down there.
No, they thought I was a lawyer assistant.
And as I said, we got a list of the first people that had ancestral homelands in Bazemore from a book on ancestral homesteads in Fayette County that was put together by Bill and Sue Tucker
Tubbs of Jasper.
from Jasper.
They got
And-
one in here.
And they had maps that showed the township and the range where those people lived. And she learned to read those maps, and she could look at the map and take you right to that spot of ground where those early people lived. And as she told Juanita, she had one of the descendants of George Brown that lives in Texas today, who found some information she had put on the internet.
I found him on Find a
On
Grave,
the
and we
Find a
started talking.
Grave site, and he was the only one that he knew in his family that was interested in knowing about his descendants. So he came to Bazemore to talk to her back in November, and she carried him and showed him where his great-great-grandfather had land and where some of his other relatives lived when they were here. So we hope this will be a help for people in the future that wants to look back and find out information about some of their ancestors that live in Bazemore. We thoroughly enjoyed doing it, and if I had it to do over again, even though it took a mighty lot of days and hours, I'd still do it again because I enjoyed it. I had always loved history, and when I first made a teacher, I majored in history and science. And I started off teaching at Hubbardsville as a history teacher, and they also gave me other areas to teach where they needed people. At that time, you could teach in areas that you hadn't majored in, whereas now, can't really do that. And I had worked on digging up the history of Hubbardsville School and preserving it. I'd gotten together a history of the White's Chapel Church, where I go to church, and I had done genealogy of my family and my husband's family on both sides. So I had a lot of history in my mind, and I guess I didn't want to stop it, so I went on with the history of Bazemore.